Well, good morning. I'm Bennett Levitan from Johnson & Johnson. And what I'm going to start is a series of four shorter talks which will take you through some of the semi-technical content of the framework. And what I'll begin with is some overview of background concepts and definitions, but it's not going to be a boring, this is defined this way, that's defined that way. I'm really going to go through three things. First, we've been throwing this word preference around a lot. It doesn't mean what the patients want. And patients want great drugs that are safe for free, and then we're done. We don't need a study for that. We mean it in a more technical term, fashion. Second, how does a decision and how do preferences interact with a decision? So I'll be thinking about that for like an individual or a population whose preferences are pretty much all the same. And with that groundwork, we'll then put it all together and ask what happens in the real world when preferences differ for a population. All right, so let's start with what preferences mean. So this is a definition, and rather than read it, I'm going to unpack it. So let's go through it piece by piece. Qualitative or quantitative statements. Okay, preference information is described by a language, and there are many, many languages that can be used. We use it all the time. We make thousands of decisions a year, and we use qualitative statements almost all the time to describe what we care about. But there's also hardcore quantitative probabilistic language that could be used for preferences. What we wanted in the framework is the ability to have both, and as you saw earlier, we're going to lean to the probabilistic language because ultimately we want to take opinion and turn it into data that has a role in regulatory and development decisions. Both qualitative and quantitative methods have a role, especially earlier development. The qualitative information is extremely important, and probabilistic or quantitative measures are overkill. As you're getting closer to making a defensible regulatory or other decision, the more quantitative types of information have a greater role. Relative. All right, so relative desirability or acceptability. Preference doesn't have a natural scale. There are things called utiles. Nobody can really communicate about those easily. But basically, I can't say I prefer out of 5. You really have to compare one thing against another. How much stroke of this type would I accept versus a heart attack? How much liver side effect would I take versus a rash side effect? Once you can compare these things against one another, you have relative measures, and that's the nature of the real world for preference. Desirability or acceptability. So Brett was referring to this earlier. We use the word preference, which sounds like a good thing, but we're using it in a way that goes in both directions. A desirability is preference for something that's positive, something you want. And acceptability is, I've got to deal with it. It's a side effect. I will accept it as long as I get some benefits. So basically, it's that relative measure. How much harm would I tolerate for how much benefit? Or as you'll see later, a more technical term, what's my maximal acceptable risk? How much risk would I tolerate for a given benefit? And finally, attributes that differ amongst the various alternative health interventions. Benefit risk is inherently comparative. I can't take a treatment or a device by itself and ask what is benefit risk. I have to compare it against something else, the standard of care, a placebo, or no device. It's not on its own. So as soon as I do that, there are going to be alternative health interventions, each of which have different properties. And when I do my preference work, I'm really going to ask, how do I compare the relative desirability or acceptability of these properties that differ amongst the various treatments that I'm considering to approve or considering using. And now that we've unpacked the definition, you could see the word patients is not definitively required in there. This definition applies to many of the other real-world circumstances where you have caregivers, physicians, payers, or regulators whose opinions you might want to characterize with preference or judgment. In fact, you can't always get preferences like for children or for people who have mental challenges. Okay, so that's the background on preference. Now, how does this concept of preference interact with the decision? So let me start with an example. So this is a almost trivial example of devices, and we don't really need to know anything more than I'm going to compare them on two attributes, one benefit and one harm, and I'm going to look at the probability of the harm, so it's a risk. The ideal device will reduce my days in the hospital as much as possible, so I want to be on the right, and have very low probability of infection, low risk, so the ideal device is on the bottom right. I have in front of me 5 devices, A, B, C, D, E. Which is the one I might choose? Well, it's pretty obvious. Device C is superior on both benefit and harm, that's it. I don't have to think very hard. Preference information is not needed at all to make a decision here. Straightforward. Now, what happens in this case? So I've just taken the same 5 devices and scrambled them around. Well, some of the decision is easy. A is clearly a better choice than E or D, and C is clearly a better choice than B. So I've whittled over half of them. The problem is I can't choose between A and C if I can't tell how important my benefit is compared to my risk. And remember, I used that word relative before. This is exactly where that relative concept comes in. I cannot choose between A and C unless I have some way of saying how important to me reducing days in the hospital is compared to reducing my probability of infection. So how do preferences help us choose? So I've just taken the 2 devices at the end, A and C, and graphed them here. This is the change in benefit if I were to go from A to C. And this is the change in risk if I were going to go to A to C. And the question to ask is, given this change in benefit, is the increase in risk too much? You can ask it the other way. Given this increase in risk, is the increase in benefit too little? So what preference studies can do is give us the maximum additional risk the patient would accept for this increase in benefit. In other words, you get roughly that orange line. That's simplifying the concept, but basically, I would know for that degree of benefit how much risk patients would be willing to take. In this mock example, they would take the orange line. Since the change in risk is less than that, I know patients would be comfortable switching from A to C. It can go the other way around. It may be switching from A to C involves far too much risk for that degree of benefit, and they wouldn't choose it. Now, I'm not saying you have to make a decision this way. I'm just showing you how the way preferences can interact with the aspects of a decision. So what makes a decision depend on preferences? There are actually 2 parts to this. I've only shown you the first. Having a clearly superior option, which is what we just saw in A and C, and what I'm not going to show because it takes too much time, but it's in the framework report, is when there's considerable uncertainty in the evidence, and even though on average A might be better than B, because of the uncertainty, it's not straightforward how people would decide. These are what we call preference-sensitive decisions, and the reason to pay attention to that term is decisions that are preference-sensitive are the kinds that may benefit from patient preference information. So the whole reason I went through this little section 2 of my discussion is to bring you to this point to understand when a decision might be such that this preference information could be useful. Now I'm going to put it all together, and it's another way of saying, in the real world, you don't have one decision maker or a group whose preferences are essentially the same, but they differ. And to do that, I have to set up a bit of a thought experiment. Okay, so if we go back to this is our favorite slide, this picture, this CDRH guidance on benefit risk. It describes that patients are going to vary in their risk tolerance or how much they value the benefits. So this thought experiment is going to show how that might play out. Now, it may look like we're talking about this mathematically, but I'm really just describing this in terms of an idea, a qualitative idea. So for this simple scenario, I have to set up a few assumptions. We know this population perfectly. The population is perfectly uniform with respect to probabilities of benefits and harms, so they don't differ with respect to that. What they do differ with respect to is preferences, and we have perfectly measured preferences. The method is valid, nobody would question it, and the preferences vary throughout the population. And finally, I'm going to make believe we can calculate what's often called an integrated benefit risk measure. It's basically a number, and it can be done probabilistically, but here it's going to be a number. It takes into account the probabilities of benefits and harms, the patient preferences, and other data. And just the way to think of it is the bigger the value, the more the benefits outweigh the risk. The smaller the value, the less the benefits outweigh the risks. And if it's positive, it's good for that patient. If it's negative, it's bad for that patient. Just conceptual. And now I'm going to put it together in a real problem, a make-believe problem. I'm going to take my patients and just splay them out along the x-axis. Any patient for which that measure is positive, the benefits outweigh the risk. Any patient for which the measure is negative, risks outweigh the benefits. So here's how it might look in this mock example. These are the patients for which benefits exceed risk, and it's 80% of the population in this made-up example. And for 20% of the population, the risks outweigh the benefits. And remember what I said before, the probabilities of benefits and harms are identical. The only reason these patients differ is because of their preference. If I were to approve this, What I'm basically saying is you, 80% of patients in this population, you get an opportunity to use this device. It's your choice. I'm going to put this on the market because the vast majority of people benefit from it. Now, I'm not saying this is a regulatory requirement. I'm just showing how the preference is into play. This provides an opportunity for that 80% to potentially use a device. And in the real world, this probably would be approved because it's so overwhelmingly obvious that for patients that benefits outweigh harms that physicians would almost certainly share their views. Now, here's a much more challenging case. In this case, benefit exceeds risk only for 10%, and again, that's based on preference only. For 90% of the population, the risk exceeds benefit. Now, if I made a decision based on the clinical data alone with my mental model as a physician for how to balance benefits and risks, I would probably rule against the device because the vast majority of patients wouldn't benefit. The problem is that 10% of patients could be very large and would benefit. One of the key ideas behind the framework, and I think it may manifest in the FDA guidance document that's just being released, is that if a decision incorporates patient preference information, you could potentially provide that 10% of the population with an opportunity to use that device. Now, I'm not saying how to do it, and it's obviously going to have a lot of complications. How it can be done, that's what we're going to continue our discussion with. But the important idea is that preferences for a population applied to the clinical data allow you to identify subgroups, some of whom would choose to use the device by preference, some of whom would choose not to use the device by preference. And let's move on. Diana?
So I'll be talking about Section 3, which is evaluating the potential value of patient preference information in regulatory benefit risk assessments. First, what's the purpose of Section 3? It's to provide insight on situations where patient preference information could advance regulatory decision making. And then kind of as a secondary purpose, to supplement that information, we also identified situations where patient preference information would probably not be valuable in the benefit risk determination. So there were a few challenges involved in creating this section. I just thought I'd talk about those a little bit. First of all, in trying to decide when patient preference information would be valuable, there's just a huge diversity in devices and the kinds of clinical indications those devices can have. And back, I was working with an AdvaMed group back when FDA had its patient preference meetings, and we looked at the questions of what kinds of devices might need patient preference information. We tried to identify categories of devices like devices that were first-of-a-kind technology, devices that address lifestyle benefits, maybe devices with direct patient interfaces, things like that. But I think we realized that we weren't going to be able to identify all the kinds of devices with that kind of a type categorization. We also tried, so I'm a regulatory person, so I tried to kind of dissect the indications for use statement and, again, look at what kinds of clinical indications might, lend themselves to patient perspective information. And then, there will be things like, well, if it addressed a rare disease or an unmet medical need, maybe if the benefit was more subjective. So we did go through that exercise and eventually decided that those kinds of factors weren't high enough level. And so we moved to these higher level factors that I'll talk about. So there's 3 factors that we currently have in the document. As others have acknowledged, this is not the final word on when patient preference information will be valuable. We fully expect this section to evolve. There is less certainty associated with when you might need patient preference information earlier in development. Some of the factors that I'll talk about are more predictable than others are. So this is the starting point. We don't have a flow chart that tells you yes or no, you do need this information. So the other challenge that we had was there's just limited experience out there with the use of patient preference information for devices. So we, as others have noted, this was a very, it was a multi-stakeholder initiative, so we did have, people from industry who understood the types of devices and some of the challenges with that. We had people from FDA who faced these issues kind of on a daily basis with benefit risk determination. We had people from the drug industry like Bennett who had worked in this space before. And, we had medical people who were experienced with shared decision-making, which kind of led to the concept of the preference sensitivity. So that was very helpful in developing this approach and editing it as we went. We did look at the experience that existed with devices, which is primarily for the obesity devices, and we also considered, what was out there in the drug world. And mostly what we found in the drug world was that preference information was helpful when you were making benefit-risk trade-offs, like there was an unexpected adverse event after approval of a drug, and you had to decide, what did that mean in terms of the benefit-risk profile. And so there were probably two breakthroughs in this section. One was when we went to the higher level factors, and the second was when we adopted this concept of preference sensitivity. So it's one of the concepts in determining whether patient preference information is valuable. It's not the only one, but it is one of the key concepts. And Bennett did outline that preference sensitivity is when you have multiple options, and it's the preferences of the decision maker that determine which option is chosen, and preference sensitivity occurs when no option is clearly superior or when there's considerable uncertainty in the evidence. So section 3 includes basically 3 categories of factors, and it also includes this other category of situations where preference information probably wouldn't be valuable. And I will say that these factor categories do overlap to some extent. So if, you may notice that. We may notice it more after having reviewed this so many times. But for example, our first category of factors, which are factors related to the perspective of patients as stakeholders, includes the fact that for a rare disease, you may need to work with someone who has experience with the disease. Those kinds of factors also apply with regulatory novelty, where if it's a rare disease, it may be a first-of-a-kind therapy for that indication. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the factors that are in these categories, not all of them, but just to give you an idea of what's in these sections. So starting with factors related to the perspective of patients as stakeholders, there may be situations where there's indication that patient preference or patient tolerance for risk is different. We might know that based on previous studies, based on information from advocacy groups, things like that. There also may be situations where you need to have experience with the disease to be able to express a preference. And again, that's kind of the rare diseases, or maybe a situation where it's more of a lifestyle benefit. There's also a situation that we discussed where there might be patient, heterogeneity in preferences, where maybe for a certain product, there is a subset of the population that feels that the benefits of the therapy outweigh the risk, and it's possible that a therapy would be approved based on that and would have a limited labeling. So the second category of factors are factors related to risk-benefit trade-offs inherent in the technology. And so here we use the example of a marginal benefit risk scenario. So you've seen the little 4x4 table now a couple of times. So if something is low risk, low benefit, and maybe it's very close, or it's high risk, high benefit, it might be that patient preference information might be able to be the tipping point to show that the benefit does exceed the risk. Another challenging benefit risk situation can be with an unmet medical need if there's, a benefit but a high risk, and you might need patient preference information to show that a certain subset of the population would accept the risk so that the product could be approved. The third factor are factors related to regulatory novelty. So one of those is familiarity with the technology. So there are a lot of technologies that introduce issues related to patient preference. It might be a technology that's less invasive. It might be a device that replaces a drug therapy or is an alternative to a drug therapy. Maybe it's a reversible treatment as opposed to an irreversible treatment. So there are different things that we'd look at related to regulatory novelty that might have preferences associated with them. And then lastly, the situations where patient preference information probably wouldn't be valuable. One is just when the patient isn't the major decision maker. And that could be, we use the example like a surgical instrument where really it's the surgeon who's making that choice and it isn't really a preference-sensitive decision from the perspective of the patient. Another one is there's already significant regulatory knowledge and precedent. So you don't need the preference information. You basically already understand what the preferences are. That's understood, and regulatory precedent exists for the approval. And then lastly, if you're lucky enough to have a situation where you have an objective endpoint and you have a huge benefit and very low risk, and the benefit-risk determination is straightforward, you also probably don't need patient preference information. So what do I want you to remember about Section 3? So, we're saying that if you consider a core set of factors, that can aid in the decision-making process for whether you need patient preference information. Secondly, in a lot of cases, multiple factors apply across these three factor categories, and the more factors that apply to your technology or clinical indication, the more likely it is that patient preference information is going to be helpful. The next is the need for patient preference information can change during the product life cycle. So, as a manufacturer, we would like to collect information and know that we need information as early as possible in our development cycle. And maybe if it's an issue of regulatory novelty, that's a little more predictable, of course. Some aspects of the preferences of patients are more predictable, but you don't know what kind of benefit-risk profile you're going to get until you do your studies. So you might get unexpected events in your clinical study or even after your approval. So those kinds of factors are less predictable. You may need to get patient preference information later in your development cycle. Although we focus on benefits and risk in these three categories of factors, other device attributes are also important in benefit-risk assessment. And so what I mean by that is that the preference sensitivity, extends to attributes like the use and means of implantation, lifestyle aspects, how frequently do you have to use something, that kind of thing. And so those factors are also important in preferences. And then lastly, others have said this, but the regulatory and statutory evidence standards for device approval don't change because you have patient preference information. So with a PMA product, you still need reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. You still have to demonstrate that with valid scientific evidence. But what I would say is the patient preference information is a different kind of evidence from a different stakeholder, and it can help in demonstrating that the benefits outweigh the risks, but approval still requires the benefits to outweigh the risks. So that would be the last message from this section. Brett, up again.
Back again. So Section 5 really talks about things to consider in implementing a patient preference study. When I talked about the catalog, we talked about a distinction between the method itself and implementing the method. And Section 5 looks more at the things to consider when implementing the method. Because the catalog is an appendix, Section 5 starts with a review of the catalog. So if you don't feel like reading the catalog, just read Section 5 and you'll get the general gist of it. But then the factors to consider are factors related to defining the research question. As I had mentioned before, we deal with that a little bit in the catalog, sort of under that general consideration section. We go into a little bit more detail here. Factors related to the fit of a particular method to that research question, and then factors related to resources available. Again, all of those things that we talk about sort of in the general consideration section of the catalog, we expand upon in Section 5. And then we end with a set of questions for sponsors and others to consider when deciding on the right method. So when it comes to the research question, it's first about the role of patient preference information. What are you going to use it for? What's the purpose of it? And that's informed by, everything that Diana and Bennett have raised already. You need to be clear on what it is you're going to use this information for. A lot of this has to do with what you know about the product. As Bennett showed in his example, he had to make a lot of assumptions when he was putting up his example. And those assumptions are pretty strong and usually don't reflect reality in most cases, especially in preference-sensitive decisions. So there are different cases where you know very little, potentially early on. You may know your benefits well, but you don't have enough experience to see or power in your samples to see harms. You may know that these things exist, but you don't know the rates at which they exist. So you have different levels of clinical information which will influence your choice of method and even whether or not to do one of these studies. Then there is the question of the patient sample. Who do you include? How much diversity in the sample do you need based on known characteristics? How are you going to look at heterogeneity that isn't explained by known characteristics? So those are all questions you need to consider when formulating your research question and planning your study. Then there's the issue of the fit of a particular method. There are three types of information that are described in Section 5. One is identifying the attributes. The second is looking at relative importance weights without necessarily having estimates of trade-offs. And then the third is trade-off information. And the methods that are in the catalog generally provide different types of information. One categorization of those is listed here, and this is in Section 5, although certain methods may be able to provide more than just a single level of information, and so this is really kind of a guide to get started, but it really comes back to thinking about what's the information you need, and then what methods are available to doing it, and then what are the other considerations you need to make in choosing among those potential methods. And then we talk about resources, as I mentioned before, another general consideration. And resources really look at time. If you're trying to include this information right before a regulatory submission and you decide, I need patient preference information in 2 months, well, you're going to have to do something pretty simple, probably. But if you're planning ahead, maybe you have more time to do things, and certain methods require more time, others require less time. What is the budget available? Now, this is a tough one, because you can do some pretty intense research pretty quickly and with low budgets, and you can do some really simple methods and have them cost millions and millions of dollars, because, you've got 18,000 people in your sample. So it really is an implementation question as well as a methodological question, but it's something to think about because the budget you have available could influence the alternatives that you have at your disposal. Prior experience. Some of these things some of the patient preference methods are pretty straightforward. Some of them require expertise. For some, there's a lot of literature out there that you can rely on, and for some, there isn't quite as much literature out there as you can rely on. So you need to determine what expertise you may have in-house to do these things, and from FDA's perspective, what expertise you have in-house to evaluate these things. And whether you have prior experience. So far, the obesity example is the example that has been out there that will be talked about multiple times today. So people are gaining experience with using that method in regulatory decision-making. Some of the other methods have been used in different contexts in regulatory decision-making, particularly a lot of the stuff that's been considered by the IMI Protect group in Europe. But, there isn't a great wealth of information that forms a track record here on how useful these things are. So as experience grows both within sponsor companies, research organizations, and FDA, you need to take into account, am I doing something relatively novel here? Or is this something where, we're just sort of following what other people have done? And as I mentioned before, expertise. So the questions to consider is, first off, designing the right research question at the forefront is probably key. That's just good research practice in general, but it's something that sometimes is overlooked. Particularly for regulatory submissions, are you trying to look at a single technology or pharmaceutical, or are you trying to look at a class? One of the novel things about the weight loss study is that it was designed specifically to look over a range of technologies, not focus on a single technology relative to a standard of care. Those can potentially be very different studies. Patient sample we've talked about before. Do you want to have the patients for whom this will be indicated today? Do you want to include patients for whom this might be indicated in the future? Do you need to oversample subpopulations that are of particular interest but who may be a relatively small portion of the patient population? What type of data are needed? How important is the study? For whatever purposes you're doing the study, how important is this component to your whole package of evidence that you're doing? And then the practical questions of how much time do you have? How much budget do you have? Do you have the expertise in-house? Do you need to go outside? Are there precedents? Are there not? These are just all things that should be on the mind of sponsors and others when talking about using a patient preference study to inform regulatory decisions. And I think that's it. Telba.
Hi, good morning. I'm from the FDA, and I'm going to talk about Section 6 of the framework that deals with the considerations that we are going to make using patient preference to inform our regulatory process. So within the framework, we made clear that this section was not a prescriptive approach to the FDA, to the Center for Devices, to tell in detail what to do with patient preferences. Unfortunately, we don't need it anymore because we have a guidance that was just released this morning, so we can refer to the guidance where we have a little bit more detail on how patient preference will be used and also will be validated. But again, talking about the benefit risk guidance, there is a important additional factor other than the benefits and the risks that deal with the patient tolerance for risk and perspective for benefit. So when we are weighting at CDRH benefits and risks, we have to put weights on the benefits and the risks. The weights will depend on the context. Context means, is it an unmet medical need? Can we defer some information to both market? How much uncertainty we have on the benefits, how much uncertainty we have on the risks, and also what is the patient tolerance for risk and perspective for benefit. That's something that's relatively new. It had been used before only anecdotally. Like if we had an advisory panel meeting, the sponsor or even patient advocacy group will bring a couple of patients that will say things in favor of the benefits or against the product, mentioning the risks, but this information was actually not representative. And we always had complaints to say, well, how much this information represents what really patients are thinking about it. So the CDRH acknowledges that patient preferences are heterogeneous, as we mentioned here before, and they also may vary from physicians' patients and even from reviewers' patients. Reviewers have their own perspective, and it was very difficult to consider patient preference as we as reviewers were reviewing a submission. So we wanted to get some patient preference into the mix. So in that guidance, we say that CDRH will consider evidence of patient preference to inform reviewers and to inform our benefit risk determination. And considering this information, we'll make sure that our decisions are patient-centric. So how can we use that in the regulatory process? I'm going to be very brief here. In the framework, if you have it, you'll read. It's a long section, but we can use it in two ways. We can use it to inform clinical trial design, and we can use it when we get to the benefit risk determination. How do we inform clinical trial design? First and foremost, what are the important endpoints? Are we measuring the endpoints in the clinical trial that are truly important to patients? Are we making our decision considering what's important to the user of the technology? So for this situation, we can use perhaps qualitative patient information that is described in the catalog and in our guidance as well. Now, if we need to use, to get more into the design of the clinical trial, we need to know what's the minimum clinically meaningful benefits for a technology that will outweigh the risks. That's our big problem at CDRH. You see some people laughing here, but that's basically what our clinicians struggle all the time. Even before we have the technology, at the time we are designing the clinical trial, how much benefit we want to see. That's very important because depending on that amount of benefit, we'll have a sample size determination for the trial. We'll have the cost of the trial determined. We have everything about the trial determined based on that meaningful benefit. What's the minimum benefit that outweighs the risk? Now we get to the end of the trial, we get our results, we know the benefits of the technology. With some uncertainty, we know the risks. Now we have to determine whether the benefits outweigh the risks. They might outweigh the risks for some patients, they might not outweigh the risk for other patients. And as was mentioned before, and I think it's very important, that subgroup of patients for which the benefits outweigh the risks might be defined but nothing more than preferences, might not be defined by the severity of the disease, might not be defined by whether they're female or male or by their gender, might be defined by the preferences. And what if this subgroup is not the majority, as Bennett mentioned? He gave a no-brainer example. 80% of patients think that the benefits outweigh the risk. What about if it's 40% of patients? If we don't approve the technology for those 40%, nobody has access to it. But if you do, the other 60% might choose something else. So this has to be taken into account as well. So to inform CDRH on the benefit risk determinations, we need to know what's the subgroup of patients independently on other covariates for which the benefits would outweigh the risks. And benefit risk preference information should be available and also understandable to these patients. That's something that we haven't touched yet, but I think it's a field that's going to be very important because we'll have to make sure that patients understand the risks and understand the benefits. And we will consider that for physicians to be able to use that in a shared decision-making context. Finally, or not finally, but importantly, patient preference information submission to the FDA is optional at the election of the interested parties, and they should submit it if they believe it can enhance their submission and if it can better inform regulatory decisions. It will be analyzed by for validity. So you see in the guidance, there are ways to say whether or not this information is valid. There is a catalog of document of methods and CDRH CBER guidance document that will advise interested parties on the collection and information and will help our reviewers to assess the information and use it in their benefit risk determinations. It is recommended that interested parties submit or talk to the FDA early if they have an intention to submit patient information. We might be able to help and we might be able to be prepared to receiving this information. Patient information may be useful to be included in the label, particularly when for preference-sensitive decisions. Again, if there is a subgroup for which benefits outweigh the risks, we will want to refer that in the label and help patients and physicians know about this subgroup. We need to use best practices for communicating these risks, benefits, and the preferences. Patient preference information may also be valuable for post-market studies, and again, it is optional at the election of sponsors if they believe it will better inform our decisions. Industry, patient groups, and FDA could proactively undertake patient preference studies, especially in areas of new and evolving medical technologies in which patient input can inform the development and can inform the regulatory considerations. Thank you.